Well, as I mentioned, this week, unexpectedly, I'm here speaking instead of Paul, so you'll have to wait a while again yet to hear Paul. But if you came to Sunday school this morning, you got the privilege. However, last week, I ran out of time, which surprised me and no one else, as I ambitiously tried to tackle the entire book of Mark in just 1 hour. So this morning, because we only gave 7 minutes to the last half of Mark, we're going to finish the last half of Mark and do it justice. By way of reminder, our brief summary of the message of Mark, that is Mark's unique purpose in writing his gospel. We have 4 different gospels, and each one is not identical, and that's not because they record inaccuracies or contradictions, but because they had different purposes for writing. And so they are choosing selectively the aspects of Christ's life which support the message that they are trying to convey to their audience. And so Mark's message is that Jesus is the Christ, that's the Messiah, who is also the Son of God, that he would suffer as a servant even to the point of death to save the world from sin and death, and that faith in him results in forgiveness of sin. We also remember this fun thing that Mark often does that scholars, as in a very scholarly term, call the Markan sandwich. That is that Mark will often report 2 different narratives or 2 different episodes, and he'll sandwich the one between the 2 halves of the other. And this, unsurprisingly, is the way that he structures his entire book. And it points towards the climax or the central section of Mark's book, which not only is the peak narrative on teaching the disciples about service, but also the peak teaching section on his identity as the Messiah. And so what we saw last week, how Mark begins his gospel by telling us that Jesus is the Christ, the Son of God, and that he is pleasing to God his Father. This morning, as we look at the end of Mark, we will see that Jesus is not just the Christ, not just the Messiah, but he is the Son of God, and that he dies for the sins of the world. Last week we saw that Jesus gathered his disciples in Galilee, and this morning we will see that he scatters his disciples in Jerusalem. Last week we saw that Jesus was rejected in Galilee when he came offering the kingdom. And here, when he comes into Jerusalem, we see that he is also rejected. Last week we saw Jesus beginning to prepare his disciples for service, but they did not understand his teaching. This morning, or actually also last week, we saw him preparing his disciples for his own suffering, and they did not understand. But right in the center, a glimmer of hope in the understanding of the disciples, seeing that they are learning gradually and learning in stages, we see Peter report half of the truth of who Christ is. He says that Jesus is the Christ. Of course, the next 3 chapters go on to teach Peter and the other disciples that he is not only the Christ, he is the Son of God, because this is one misconception that the Pharisees, the Sadducees, and all those waiting for a Messiah had. They did not believe that the Messiah himself would be God. They believed that he would be another man, perhaps another Pharisee, who would come and help them fill out the holes in the law. Now, there are no holes in the law, but the Pharisees had made a practice of adding to the law, and they thought that the Messiah would come and help them add to the law. That is not what he did, and in fact, Jesus purposefully subverts their expectations, purposefully contradicts their traditions, but always strictly adheres to the law of Moses. So in our prologue, which was just the first 13 verses of chapter 1, Mark gave his title, the beginning of the gospel of Jesus Christ, the Son of God. Notice he starts it as the beginning. He doesn't give us a part 2, but he does tell us the story is not concluded, or the story doesn't end in just what he tells us. And we'll see at the end of the Gospel of Mark that that is very true. He leaves us on a cliffhanger. Then we see that John is Jesus' forerunner, not only announcing the Christ, the Messiah of God, and his arrival, but also serving as a foreshadowing of what will happen to Christ himself. And then we see Jesus Christ arrive on the scene, and we get 2 episodes with him, his baptism and his temptation. And at his baptism, a voice from heaven cries out that he is my beloved Son, in whom I am well pleased. He is the Son of God. And then we see him tempted in the wilderness after 40 days, and we see that he rejects Satan's offer to be his Messiah and instead proves himself to be a faithful Messiah of God the Father. Part 1 then of the gospel begins in chapter 1 verse 14 and goes through chapter 6 verse 6. We have Jesus gathering his disciples and then rejected in Galilee. As he gathers his disciples, he begins teaching them immediately. And what he is teaching them is about his messiahship. This, I think, is why Peter is primed and ready to announce halfway through the gospel that you are the Christ. Because they all witnessed these messianic miracles, these miracles that only the Christ would be able to do. And so his teaching, combined together with the miracles that confirmed his teaching, taught the disciples over a period of time that he is indeed the Christ. And then he, as I mentioned, subverts these expectations of the Pharisees, which leads to their personal rejection of him. And the Pharisees, being the thought leaders in Galilee, lead the people of Galilee to reject Jesus as well. At first, they were receiving him. But when the leaders that they were following already, the Pharisees, rejected him, they followed suit and rejected him also. This is why Jesus, when he comes back from the Decapolis and arrives in Galilee, and he looks at the people and has compassion on them before he feeds 5,000 of them, he says, they are like sheep without a shepherd. And his compassion is not for their hunger, but for their spiritual hunger. They're not being taught. And so he begins to feed them by teaching them. And then after he has taught them for a while, he also gives them bread and fish. Well, the Pharisees or the disciples don't quite understand this teaching, because when he arrives again onto the shore and tells his disciples, go and feed these people, they don't understand. They say, Jesus, how can we do that? We don't have enough money to pay for the food for them. Well, they should have first understood that what Jesus was talking about was teaching. He had prepared them to teach. He had sent them out teaching before. And now they are looking at it not from a spiritual perspective, but still from a carnal perspective. Not only that, though, but they had seen the miraculous work of Jesus, that he was able to feed 5,000 with just a few loaves of bread and a few fish. And so they should have no problem believing that he could do the same for a mere 4,000. But in all of this, after the rejection of Jesus Christ in Galilee, we see him venturing off into Gentile regions and also briefly being rejected in the Decapolis, though he's going to be received later in the Decapolis. Part 2 of the gospel, which we did get through last week, is Jesus' servant ministry in Galilee, but actually that's not a good title because he spends most of his time outside of Galilee in Gentile areas. And then the second half of part 2 is spent in his journey from Caesarea Philippi, north of Galilee, all the way back through Galilee and through Samaria, though we don't get any episodes from Samaria, until he finally arrives in Jerusalem at the end of chapter 10. So those 5 chapters have him mostly in Gentile regions and traveling to Jerusalem. In the first part, we have John's fate recorded for us. John was executed by Herod on false premises. And so we also expect, as John is the foreshadowing of the Messiah, that the Messiah will also be captured on false premises And this is the beginning of Christ's teaching his disciples about his own fate. Then we have Jesus dealing with the fear and faith issue that his disciples and the people witnessing his message and his teaching and his miracles often had a response of fear rather than faith. As we moved into that last half of part 2, Jesus begins a very private ministry to his disciples. Although he's still doing some miracles, and although he is still teaching some publicly, whenever he does a miracle and whenever he teaches publicly, he will then pull his disciples aside and teach them a deeper message or a greater understanding of what has just occurred. And each of these 3 narratives emphasize a certain prediction of his own death. In chapters 8, in chapters 9, and in chapters 10, we get 3 unique predictions of Christ's own suffering, death, and resurrection in the plainest possible language. And yet, we see the disciples' response is fear and not faith. The first prediction in chapter 8, he continued by questioning them, "But who do you think, or who do you say that I am?" Peter answered him and said to him, "You are the Christ." And he warned them not to tell anyone about him. Jesus was not ready to have this information known so publicly because this public information would result in a sentence of blasphemy. But in verse 31, he continues, he began to teach them that the Son of Man must suffer many things and be rejected by the elders and the chief priests and the scribes and be killed, and after 3 days rise again. And he was stating the matter plainly. Remember, his means of teaching publicly, although Mark doesn't detail this for us very clearly, he makes a statement of it, that whenever Jesus taught publicly, he no longer taught plainly, but he taught in parables as a consequence of their rejecting his offer of the kingdom. And so in these predictions, you could say that there is no possible way to state it more clearly, and yet because it contradicted their preconceived notions about who the Messiah would be and what he would do, they failed to believe what would happen. And so the second prediction in chapter 9, from there they went out and began to go through Galilee, and he did not want anyone to know about it. For he was teaching his disciples and telling them, the Son of Man is to be delivered into the hands of men, and they will kill him, and when he has been killed, he will rise 3 days later. And they did not understand this statement, and they were afraid to ask him. The third prediction in Mark chapter 10 is the clearest, the most detailed, and the most poignant. They were on the road going up to Jerusalem. They are almost there. In fact, there's only one more episode that occurs between their arrival in Jerusalem and this prediction, and that is the healing of the blind man in 2 stages, Bartimaeus, showing that the disciples too, although they are partially blind, will have their eyes fully opened at a certain point. But they were on the road going up to Jerusalem, and Jesus was walking on ahead of them. And they were amazed, and those who followed were fearful. And again, he took the 12 aside and began to tell them what was going to happen to him, saying, "Behold, we are going up to Jerusalem, and the Son of Man will be delivered to the chief priests and the scribes, and they will condemn him to death and will hand him over to the Gentiles. They will mock him and spit on him and scourge him and kill him, and 3 days later he will rise again." Mark 10:32 to 34 gives us an outline of the next 6 chapters. Plot for plot, this is exactly what happens to Jesus. Part 3, Jesus' sacrificial suffering in Jerusalem, breaks into 2 parts as well. First, just as he was rejected in Galilee, he is about to be rejected in Jerusalem. And then Jesus will gather and scatter his disciples in chapters 14, 15, and 16. Well, part one, his rejection in Jerusalem, first begins with his triumphal entry into Jerusalem. And we see that the Jews do not understand what is happening when he rides into Jerusalem. Then we see him tested for his purity and proved to be pure and perfect. And not only that, but Mark chooses to record an episode which proves that he is the Son of God as well, which is the primary teaching point of the second half of Mark. And then we see Jesus prophesying of the coming destruction of the temple, but he pulls out a section of Jesus' teaching that Matthew does not record for us, and it focuses on the suffering ministry of the disciples because he is training them to suffer on his behalf as he is suffering on theirs. Jesus enters Jerusalem here in chapter 11. I don't know what happened to my versification there. It's chapter 11, verse 1 through chapter 12, verse 12. His triumphal entry is recorded very briefly in Mark. It's given a much longer handling in the Gospel of Luke. But we see the first seven verses of this 10-verse section all focused on acquiring a colt for the Lord. Jesus tells his disciples what they are going to see as soon as they enter into the city. And as soon as they enter into the city, they're going to see a colt tied to a post, and they're going to untie him and bring them there. And if anyone asks what you're doing, say, the master, the Lord, the Kyrios, has need of the colt, and the man will let you take him. And that's exactly what happens. In fact, the three verbs that are used of Jesus' command to his disciples are the exact three verbs used to summarize what happened when the disciples entered into Jerusalem. Now they should see this and they should think, well, if that happened exactly how he said when we entered into Jerusalem, what else has he said will happen as soon as we enter into Jerusalem? Well, his death and resurrection. But yet, they did not believe. The entire triumphal entry is simply recorded in a brief statement at the beginning of verse 8 rather, and then we see the Hosanna chorus in 8 through 10 as he enters in, and men and women throw palm fronds and branches from the fields at his feet, and they cry out, Hosanna, which means save us. The irony of this statement is not lost on Mark, though it is certainly lost on those who are shouting, Hosanna, Hosanna in the highest. They recognize him as the Son of David, but yet that is what they have rejected. They have rejected him as the Messiah of God. As Jesus enters, we get, again, very little statement about his interactions with the crowd. We don't even get the statement of his sadness as we get in Luke chapter 19, I think it is. But we see him entering into Jerusalem, and the first thing that he does is enter into the temple and merely look around and then leave. No statements of any words that he spoke, no teaching, no miracles. It seems almost anticlimactic until we realize what is happening. He is observing the temple and what needs to be done in the temple. Each night of his stay in Jerusalem, he didn't actually sleep within the city. He would cross over the Mount of Olives to the other side and stay in Bethany. Bethany, of course, is where Mary and Martha and Lazarus live, as well as another leper that he had cleansed. And so each night, after he entered the temple and departed, he went back across the Mount of Olives and stayed there. And as he was going across the Mount of Olives, he encountered a fig tree. And being hungry and seeing that the fig tree had leaves on it, which is a sign that there is fruit, he went to see if there was fruit, and there was none. The tree was giving off a false sign of the fruit that it bore. And so he cursed the fig tree. Well, this is another Markan sandwich. We're going to come back to the fig tree on the next morning when the disciples cross over again. Or actually, this was the first morning as they're crossing back into the temple compound. They're going to walk maybe 5 minutes up the hill from the Mount of Olives into the temple compound, and Jesus begins overturning tables, sending the money changers out, and stopping the sale of these doves, or the dove salesmen in the temple. He's cleansing the temple of all of their ungodliness that they have brought into it, turning the house of God, which is supposed to be a temple of prayer for all the peoples, into a den of thieves and robbers. And when he leaves the temple that night, as they're crossing back through the garden, Peter notices the fig tree and sees that it is shriveled, not just withered, but dead from the roots up. Jesus has cursed the current generation of Israel as well. Because of their rejection of him, because of their false righteousness, because of their religiosity that had no true righteousness involved in it, they rejected the Messiah, and the Messiah has rejected that generation, and that generation is going to be left with a desolate house, just as the fig tree has shriveled. And that's what he is going to begin teaching in Mark chapter 13, where he teaches on the destruction of Jerusalem because of the rejection of Jesus the Messiah. But before he does that, he teaches the disciples privately about faith, and he tells them, believe in God, a very clear statement. And this seems to be the repudiation of the Pharisees that he encounters in the temple, because their problem is they don't actually believe in God. Sure, they believe that he exists, but do they trust him, and do they know him? They do not. They don't trust him for salvation. They trust Abraham for salvation. They don't trust in God's provision of a sacrifice on their behalf. They trust in their own works and their own righteousness. Jesus is telling the disciples to believe God. And what are the words of God that they have heard spoken twice now? This is my beloved Son, in whom I am well pleased. And when they saw him on the Mount of Transfiguration, and the voice of God spoke and said that very thing, he also added, listen to him. Are they listening to Jesus so as to learn from him? Because he's made some very clear statements about his purposes in Jerusalem, and they have not yet understood. Jesus enters back into Jerusalem on the third day. This is a Tuesday now. And it begins a 3-day testing by the priests, the elders, the scribes, the Pharisees, the Sadducees, the Herodians, basically every leadership group that exists in Israel. Jesus is tested in the temple beginning on Tuesday and ending on Thursday, although the Gospel of Mark does not show us the break in the days. We see from a harmony of the three Gospels that this was a 3-day process. Jesus is tested on the same day that the Passover lambs are brought into the temple compound for testing of their purity, to see if they are worthy sacrifices for the day of Passover. The priests and the elders speak up first as they're in the temple compound. It's no wonder that the priests are the first to engage with Jesus there. And their first line of attack concerns Jesus' authority. Why? Because wherever he goes, he teaches with authority. And as Mark announces earlier, this authority is met with astonishment and fear by the people who hear it. And so they ask him, by whose authority do you teach? By whose authority do you heal? And Jesus, rather than answering plainly, answers with a question. And he says, "First you answer me this question, by whose authority does John baptize?" Well, this caught them in a quandary because they feared the response of the peoples. They were not concerned with truth. They were concerned with the response that they would receive from the crowds. You see, if these priests and elders respond that John's authority to baptize is not from God, they're going to have a rebellion among the people because John was a bit of a populist and the people loved him. But if he says that it is from God, well, John's baptism confirmed Jesus Christ as the Messiah of God's choosing, and they would have no choice but to accept Jesus and his teaching. And so they couldn't answer. And then Jesus gives them an answer by way of a parable. Again, pointing back to the curse that Israel is under, that they're not going to receive clear teaching anymore because they will be responsible for that clear teaching on the day of judgment, and he is being merciful to them. But he teaches them here with a parable, and this is the parable of the vine growers, where a king leaves his country for a while and he leaves men in charge, and every once in a while he will send a servant to see how they're doing, and they will beat and kill those servants. Until finally the king sends his very own son. Again, Jesus is teaching them about his sonship in the second half of Mark. And they beat and kill and reject this son of the vine grower. Why? Because they think that if they get rid of the heir, then they will be able to take the kingdom for themselves. This reminds us a lot of Matthew or of John's statements that the kingdom of God has undergone violence until now, and men seek to take it by force. They've killed the prophets of God. They killed the prophet of God, John the Baptist, and they are about to kill the Son of God. The Pharisees understood what he was saying. In fact, Mark even tells us explicitly they understood that this parable was against them. And so they sought to seize him, but it wasn't yet his time to be seized. The Pharisees and the Herodians were the next to attack Jesus and to test and prove his purity. The Pharisees, again, were very zealous nationalists for Israel, while the Herodians were sellouts to the Roman authority, as Herod was a puppet king of Rome. And so they come to him together, these enemies, political enemies, in order to test him so that one of the two parties would be offended by it. And the question is concerning the poll tax. Is it proper to pay a Roman poll tax? If he says no, then it would please the Pharisees, but it would give the Herodians reason to have him executed for sedition under Roman law. And if he says yes, then the Pharisees will be unhappy and will be able to sway the opinion of the people that Jesus is pro-Rome and not pro-Israel. But the question is a false premise. You see, there are two divine authorities recognized by God, his own authority and the authority of government that he has put over people. God has instituted both, his own authority and the authority of governments. And so Jesus, in answering, says, look at the coin whose face is on it. Render unto Caesar what is Caesar's. The money that they use is Rome's money. Give back to Rome what is Rome's, but give to God what is his. See, the Pharisees taught that willingness to submit to Roman rule was an implicit rejection of the sovereign rule of God over Israel. This is false. It does not imply that. Our willingness to submit to a government that is ungodly, so long as the things that the government is telling us to do not directly contradict God, that is not an ungodly thing to do. The Herodians benefited from Roman taxation, and thus they didn't oppose this taxation. In all of these cases, they are They respond by recognizing the wisdom of Christ, the unexpected answers that he gave, but seeing that he is not only a good teacher, but a wise teacher. Now the Sadducees come alone to attack him, and they attack him on the basis of the resurrection. The Sadducees did not believe in the resurrection because they only believed in the first 5 books of the Old Testament as authoritative, and they thought that Moses did not teach the resurrection. They could not find a single place where he explicitly talks about the afterlife, the resurrection of the dead into life, but there are 3 places at least in the writings and the prophets where resurrection is explicitly taught, especially in Daniel and the Psalms. And the Pharisees did take the entire Old Testament canon as authoritative. And so this was a conflict between the Sadducees and the Pharisees primarily. The Sadducees attack him on a, again, false premise because they believe that there is no resurrection, and so they're trying to catch him in a contradiction. And they say if this man and his wife fail to have children, and then a kinsman redeemer comes up after the husband has died and marries the woman, and so on and so forth, on to 7 husbands, well, in the resurrection, whose husband is she? Or whose wife is she? He says this is a false presupposition because the things in the resurrection are not like the things in this world. This doesn't disprove the resurrection. It just proves their misunderstanding that different economies of God have different organizational rules. Then he teaches them that Moses does indeed teach the resurrection. We can look back to Genesis chapter 22 and see that Abraham's willingness to sacrifice his own son points towards his belief that God would resurrect that son. And this is an argument that Jesus uses because Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob all went to the grave without receiving the promises that God had made. And they know that God must be faithful to his promises, therefore, in order to render to them the promises that he has given them, he must raise them from the dead. So Moses does teach resurrection because he teaches the faithfulness of God. And his conclusion from this is God the God of the living or the dead? He's the God of the living, and he will bring the dead into life. The scribes come and attack him again by themselves. And here they ask him, what is the chief commandment of the law of Moses? And he answers, with full understanding of the spirit of the law and not just the letter of the law, that the first and greatest commandment is to love God. Quoting from Deuteronomy 6:4 through 5, the Shema. And then he says, without them asking what the second commandment is, and that is to love your neighbor. This, of course, would be a proper result from loving God. Now, the scribes recognize that he has answered well and that he has answered wisely. But then Jesus challenges the scribes. They've asked him a question. Now he gets to ask them a question. He said, whose son is the Messiah? You say that the son of David will be the Christ, but then David calls this Christ, the Messiah, Lord. How can David call him Lord unless he is God? What is Jesus trying to lead the scribes to understand? That their own understandings of the Messiah should naturally lead to what he's trying to teach them. That the Christ is the Son of God, and that he is the Christ. He is the Son of God. But the response of the scribes, no one is willing to answer his question. Why? Because it necessarily leads to the conclusion that he is the Son of God. But then Jesus goes a little step further after invalidating their arguments and validating his own, and he begins to teach the people about these scribes and say that they love to be first among the people. They love to take the place of authority while they ought not to. He says that their law-keeping is for show and for self-gain. They have misunderstood the spirit of the law, and they seek self-righteousness. And then he points over to the widow who puts merely 2 mites into the temple treasury, and he says this woman has given more because she's given secretly. She's given quietly, not for self-gain, not for show, but simply giving to God. Now, this is the last thing that we are told happens in the temple before they leave the temple. And as they leave the temple, the disciples begin to look back and admire just how beautiful it is. And Jesus takes the opportunity to teach them about the consequences of rejection. They've just rejected him. They tested him for his purity. They found that he was pure, and yet they did not believe. He rode in as the Messiah into Jerusalem, and although the people shouted his name and shouted, "Hosanna," save us, they did not actually look to him for salvation. And so, as he leaves the temple compound and climbs back up the Mount of Olives, he begins to teach them that the temple, just like the fig tree, is going to be left desolate to Israel. Now, the Olivet Discourse is recorded in 3 of the 4 Gospels, all 3 of the Synoptic Gospels. And while in most of this I've stuck to just pointing out what happens in Mark, here, so that we can understand better what's going on, I've also included the sections that Mark leaves out, because some of the statements that Jesus made serve very well and are important in Matthew's argument, or important in Luke's argument, but don't quite serve Mark's argument. And so he's not saying that they didn't happen. He's not bringing them up, because he's being very concise, and he doesn't want you to get confused or lost in the woods. He wants you to understand clearly what his message is. And so in verses 1 through 4, they look at the temple and they ask, or they want Jesus to admire the temple, but instead he says, not one stone will be left upon another. This is a consequence, the destruction of the temple. And so they ask him, when will this happen? When will be the destruction of the temple? When will be the end of the age? And they think these things must go together, because how can the temple be destroyed and it not be the end of the world? And Jesus first tells them things that cannot be considered as signs, and then things that will precede the signs of the end. And so we have anti-signs, Jesus saying this is not a sign, and then anti-signs, anti with an E meaning before, meaning that this will come before any signs occur. Jesus began to say to them, "See to it that no one misleads you. Many will come in my name, saying, 'I am he,' and will mislead many. When you hear of wars and rumors of wars, do not be frightened. These things must take place, but that is not yet the end." What is he saying? That none of these things contribute to a sign of the end. Ironically, when we listen to Christian talk radio, they will pull out these things, wars and rumors of wars, and Matthew's edition of earthquakes, and say that this must be the end. Just like the disciples, they hear the clear statements of God and do not understand. He says these are not signs of the end. These are things that will happen throughout the entire age to come. They're not unique. Don't think of them as signs. But then he says, nation will rise up against nation, and kingdom against kingdom. There will be earthquakes in various places. There will also be famines. These things are merely the beginning of birth pangs. These happen before any signs of the end. Then he breaks down in a little bit more detail the pre-signs, the anti-signs. Luke gives us a summary of their sequence, which Mark skips, but Mark goes right into the series of suffering of the disciples. This is looking not towards the eschatological destruction of the temple, not towards the destruction of the temple during the tribulation period, but the destruction of the temple in the lifetime of the disciples. Actually, the disciples, many of them, if not almost all of them, will die before the temple is destroyed. But John, for example, who is one of the 4 disciples who is asking Jesus these questions, John will be alive for the destruction of the temple. And this is Jesus' summary of what will happen to them before they see any signs that the temple is about to be destroyed. He says, "Be on your guard, for they will deliver you to the courts, and you will be flogged in the synagogues, and you will stand before governors and kings for my sake as a testimony to them." These are the things that Jesus has predicted about his own death, that he is going to stand trial before not only the Jews but the Gentiles, and he'll be handed over to death. The gospel must first be preached to all the nations, and it's the next evening that Jesus is going to teach the disciples that he is sending them out to preach the gospel, just as he sent them out back in chapter 6. Just as they came back and they were amazed by the power and authority that they were able to teach and to heal with, and then he goes on to teach them more. Well, this more that he taught them is what they need to go out and teach others now after his ascension. But when they arrest you, he says, and hand you over, again, the very verb that he used for his own prediction of death, do not worry beforehand about what you are to say, but say whatever is given you in the hour. For it is not you who speak, but it is the Holy Spirit. This is going to be something he repeats to them in John chapter 17 in the upper room discourse, that he is giving them the Holy Spirit to bring to their recollection all that Jesus has taught them. Verse 12, brother will betray brother to death, and a father his child, and children will rise up against parents and have them put to death. You will be hated by all because of my name, but the one who endures to the end, he will be saved. This is Jesus teaching the disciples about what is to happen in Jerusalem over the next few decades. While we see much of this occurring throughout the world wherever the word of God is taught, the specific prediction deals with Jerusalem. The specific prediction takes into account the reaction of Jews to this offensive message, this scandalon, this stumbling block that Jesus Christ is the Son of God. This is the message that the Jews rejected, the chief cornerstone. And the result, family itself will be disintegrated. Families will turn against their own family members. We'll have them cast out of the synagogues. We'll have them dispossessed from the nation. We'll have them rejected and even have them killed. But while many might be killed by the hand of God, when destruction falls in God's, or by the hand of men, when God's judgment falls on Jerusalem, those who have maintained the message, those who have continued to believe in God, will not be swept up in the destruction of the temple. In fact, we see this in Matthew's gospel a little more clearly, and we see this in Hebrews as well, especially chapters 12 and 13, that they heed the warning signs about the destruction of the temple. When the city is surrounded by the Roman armies, this is the time to get out. There was a brief break in the supply chain, and the siege was briefly broken, and this was the opportunity that 1.1 million Jews took to flee the city. Those who listened to and heeded Christ's warning about the coming destruction. They were saved. They did not fall under the destruction of the temple in Jerusalem. And then he finally gets to answering their question in verse 14. They didn't ask the prefatory questions that he needed to give them, but then he goes on to answer, okay, here's when the temple is going to be destroyed. These will be the signs that you will see. And this is speaking to an eschatological, a future generation of Israel, who is going to see the abomination of desolation enter into the temple, and they'll know at that point, in the tribulation period, to flee from Jerusalem, because the same kind of destruction is going to come. And so those will be the signs of the end. And then he also tells them that this will be the greatest period of suffering for the Jews in all of history. Though the Holocaust had not yet happened, many things similar to the Holocaust had happened under Babylon and Egypt and Assyria. The Jews had already suffered, and there was much more suffering to come for the Jews, but nothing could be compared to the suffering of the Jews during the tribulation. And so he is warning them that this is a specific anti-Semitic attack of Satan against the chosen people of God in the tribulation period. But just as they will suffer and possibly die on his behalf prior to the judgment that God is sending on first century Israel, they might suffer and die at the hands of Satan during the tribulation period, but they will be spared the judgment of God when he brings down destruction in the final day. And he says it's at that point, after this anti-Semitic campaign, after Satan has chased them into the wilderness, that Jesus Christ himself will return and he will gather Israel together for their salvation. He says, but in those days after the tribulation, the sun will be darkened and the moon will not give its light, and the stars will be falling from heaven, and the powers that are in the heavens will be shaken. Then they will see the Son of Man coming in the clouds with great power and glory. And then he will send forth the angels and will gather together his elect from the four winds, from the furthest end of the earth to the furthest end of heaven. We all know Matthew's long string of parables that he gives at the end of the Olivet Discourse. Mark leaves most of them out. He only gives us two parables at the end. The first one is the parable of the fig tree, which is a paradigm parable that teaches us how to understand parables. And we've already seen something very similar to it just a day earlier on the Mount of Olives. That when a fig gives its leaves, this is a sign of what's to come. Jesus has just taught them about signs and that they need to heed the signs. You see, in another place in Luke, Jesus had repudiated the Pharisees because they were able to look into the sky and see the signs of what's to come the next day by way of weather, but they weren't able to see the signs of the prediction of his first coming. And so he's telling them, be ready for the second coming. I'm coming again, and when you see the signs of my arrival, make sure that you are ready. And he only gives them one parable of readiness, and this is the parable of the doorkeeper, which is, again, specifically targeted at the leadership of Israel. Oops. He says, take heed and keep on alert, for you do not know when the appointed time will come. It is like a man away on a journey, who upon leaving his house and putting his slaves in charge, assigned to each one his task, also commanded the doorkeeper to stay on the alert. Therefore be on the alert, for you do not know when the master of the house is coming, whether in the evening, at midnight, or when the rooster crows, or in the morning. In case he should come suddenly and find you asleep, what I say to you, I say to all, be on alert. Now remember when the Magi came into the city of Jerusalem and they sought to learn where the Messiah would be born, and the scribes were able to answer. The Magi knew the time, they knew the sign, they knew where to come, and they were just seeking the specific location, and they find out that it's in Bethlehem. The scribes knew full well. They knew the signs were being fulfilled. The problem was they did not care. This was not what they were concerned with, not what they were looking for. And he's teaching the doorkeepers here, you better be on alert. He's just spent 2 chapters proving the impurity of the leaders, the Pharisees, the Sadducees, the Herodians, the scribes, the priests, and the elders. They're the doorkeepers, and they better be on alert. Of course, he skips the sheep and the goat judgment, which deals with the judgment in the end of the Gentiles, because it's not his purpose here. Moving into chapter 14, we have Jesus in the Last Supper, and then his arrest and trial in Jerusalem, and finally his death and resurrection. The Last Supper actually begins with an editorial statement by Mark telling us that the Pharisees and the Sadducees and the Herodians were plotting together to have Jesus killed, but they didn't want to have him killed on the festival because they didn't want to cause a riot. The festival that they're talking about is the Passover, and this is the day before Passover. It's not the actual day of Passover, but Jesus is having his disciples prepare a meal that they would share together on the day before Passover. In this preparation, we learn in Mark's gospel that it takes place, or at least the beginning of this takes place, in Bethany at Simon the leper's house. Bethany was a non-leper town, too. Bethany was a place where lepers were not allowed to live. The fact that a leper not only lived in the city but owned a house in the city speaks to Jesus' miraculous power, because what was he doing? He was there healing lepers, a messianic miracle, something that no person in history had ever done in Jerusalem. Jesus came and not only did once, not only did twice, but did again and again and again. Only in the days of Jesus, Messiah, could a leper live in Bethany, and yet he did. Bethany, again, is also the place where Mary, Martha, and Lazarus lived, where Jesus spent his evenings outside of the city of Jerusalem so that he would not be arrested and taken away before the time was right. This also is immediately following this whole triumphal entry and testing in Jerusalem happened right after Jesus had resurrected their brother from the dead, which is recorded in John chapter 11. This, we're about to see, is reported to us in John chapter 12 as well, in parallel. We learn in John's gospel that it's Mary who anoints Jesus' feet with oil, and that Mary alone seems to have understood Jesus' prediction of his own death. The disciples who had spent all this time with him didn't understand. But Mary, who had sat at his feet and learned from him, who wasn't too busy to sit and listen, who just simply sat and believed the words that he spoke, that simple faith, that faith like a child, prepared her to understand what was happening. And so she anoints his feet for burial. While he was in Bethany, at the home of Simon the leper, and reclining at the table, there came a woman with an alabaster vial of very costly perfume of pure nard. And she broke the vial and poured it over his head. But some were indignant, remarking to one another, "Why has this perfume been wasted?" For this perfume might have been sold for over 300 denarii, and the money given to the poor, and they were scolding her. John, of course, tells us that Judas was the primary one concerned because he was pilfering from the treasury box. But Jesus said, "Let her alone. Why do you bother her? She has done a good deed to me. For you always have the poor with you, and whenever you wish, you can do good to them, but you do not always have me. She has done what she could. She has anointed my body beforehand for the burial." This was no secret. Jesus was teaching them openly that he would be handed over, crucified, die, be buried, and raised again on the third day. Truly I say to you, wherever the gospel is preached in the whole world, what this woman has done will also be spoken of in her memory. I find it ironic that Mark doesn't tell us her name or who she is, but John does. Then Judas Iscariot, who was one of the 12, went off to the chief priests in order to betray him to them. He betrays them for a small sum of money. They were glad when they heard this and promised to give him money, and he began seeking how to betray him at an opportune time. Jesus begins then preparing for the Passover celebration, and he has to instruct his disciples because they're preparing a day early. And we learn in the other Gospels that they didn't understand that this was their Passover celebration. They, at a certain point during the Passover celebration, Jesus sends Judas away, and the disciples rationalize this in their mind, thinking that he is sending him away to go prepare for the Passover meal, while they're sitting and enjoying their Passover meal, but a day early. Well, the location that they would observe the Passover meal was first acquired. Jesus told them that they would see a sign, a man carrying a jar of water, which was a woman's job, and that he would be doing this at night, which is an uncommon time for this to be done. And so it would serve as a sign, and they saw that, and the man had prepared a house, a room for them, and this is the upper room where they ate their meal. Now, if you remember our Passover service 2 weeks ago, the carpus was the dipping of the bitter herbs into the salt water, and it was during this where Jesus said that whoever dips his hand into the bowl with me, he is the one who betrays me. John tells us explicitly that Judas is the one who dips his hand in, and yet they still didn't understand. Mark doesn't tell us exactly who dips his hand in the bowl with Jesus, but we do learn from Matthew's gospel that Judas is sitting on his left and John is sitting on his right, and those would be the two sharing the bowl with Jesus. The disciples do not know who it will be. The consequences for that one will be great. And consider this, if he has begun to teach all of Israel in parables so that they wouldn't become more culpable for the revelation that God has given them concerning his son, how much more culpable would a disciple who has all of this revelation and yet has not believed? That is why Jesus says it would be better for Judas never to have been born. He is the son of perdition because his judgment on the day of judgment will far exceed even the Pharisees who led to the rejection of Jesus. We also have in Matthew some of the teaching about Jesus and the ways that he fulfills the Passover service. We have the eating of the middle matzah, which, if we recall from our Passover service, is a foreshadowing of the death of the Messiah. The unleavened, sinless bread, the striped bread, striped for our sins, and pierced through. Then they drink the third cup after Judas has left. And Jesus applies this to his own sacrifice in Luke's gospel. Then Jesus claims that Peter will deny him 3 times before the sun rises, before the beginning of the day. And then he leads them across the way from the upper room into the Garden of Gethsemane, which wouldn't be strange for them. The upper room is in the old city of Jerusalem, and just as they did every night, they're crossing over the Mount of Olives to go to Bethany. But before they cross the Mount of Olives, they stop at the base in the Garden of Gethsemane. Jesus goes up a little further to pray by himself before they go. Of course, we all know what happens to the disciples here. 3 times Jesus has to tell them to wake up and stay alert, but they keep falling asleep. And on the 3rd time, when Jesus responds, he tells them, never mind, the one who comes to betray, he's already here. And so it's there in the Garden of Gethsemane, in the valley of Kidron, at the base of the Mount of Olives, that Judas betrays Jesus with a kiss. And then Jesus is arrested And Peter cuts off the soldier's ear, and Jesus heals it and warns Peter that whoever lives by the sword will die by the sword. And then the disciples scatter, fleeing in fear and shame. Well, Jesus is hauled away by these Roman soldiers and brought first to Caiaphas's private courtyard. And here he undergoes a religious trial by the religious Sanhedrin so that they could find something to accuse him of that would not only satisfy the Jews to send him to death, but would also satisfy Roman law. Because it has been about 4 months at this time since the Romans took away Israel's right to execute their own criminals, so that Rome and Rome alone would be able to execute a criminal in Israel. And this is not without divine appointment, because the Jewish means of execution was death by stoning. But the Roman means of execution was crucifixion. And Jesus, in order to die for our sins, needed to hang upon a cross. And so it's here before the Sanhedrin, which was made up of the high priest, 24 lower priests, 24 scribes, and 24 elders, both from the Pharisee camp. It means that there's 48 Pharisees and 25 Sadducees present. Now I think it's only 23 need to be present in order for this trial to go forward. And it happens in the middle of the night, in the very wee hours of the night. We know at least 2 Pharisees who were not there, Nicodemus and Joseph of Arimathea. They were both Pharisees and both members of the Sanhedrin, and both absent that night. But the officers led Jesus into the courtyard, and here's actually a picture of Caiaphas' courtyard. It's not huge, but you can see up there in the top left corner the gold dome of the Dome of the Rock, and that is where the temple would have stood. Caiaphas' house was in view of the temple. And then you see the other arrow pointing towards the very center top. That's the Garden of Gethsemane. They've led him just up the hill, and now just out of sight in the red, with the red arrow, is where they had just eaten the Passover meal. This is all happening in a very small area. In fact, both Caiaphas' courtyard and the upper room are within that red circle. Jesus is tried there by Caiaphas, the high priest, and the Sanhedrin, and they're searching for an accusation rather than trying an accusation. When they bring him before the court, they don't announce what they believe he's guilty of and seek evidence to see if he is indeed guilty of it. They're trying to find something to accuse him of. And so they bring witness after witness after witness to see if any 2 people would agree on one accusation, and they could find nothing. Until they found someone who was willing to lie about the accusation. Well, because they couldn't find an accusation that would stand up in court, Caiaphas asks Jesus himself, "Are you the Messiah?" And what does Jesus answer? The high priest stood up and came forward and questioned Jesus, saying, "Do you not answer? What is it that these men are testifying against you?" But he kept silent and did not answer. Again the high priest said, questioning him and saying to him, "Are you the Christ, the Son of the Blessed One?" Now they don't say the name God, and so this is their way, the Blessed One, of saying God. And what was Mark's purpose statement in the gospel? That this is the beginning of the gospel of Jesus Christ, the Son of God. When Peter announced who Jesus was in Caesarea Philippi, he announces, "You are the Christ." And Jesus goes on to teach them that he is also the Son of God. And so Caiaphas has hit the nail on the head here. And Jesus responds, "I am," which is an emphatic statement, even in the Greek. And it harkens back to Exodus, where God teaches Israel his own name, I am. This is the second time this evening that he has made this statement in another one of the Gospels, when he is found in the Garden of Gethsemane and they ask for his identity and he responds, I am, and the Roman soldiers fall down because of the power of the statement. Jesus Christ, the Son of God, identifying himself as God. He says, I am, and you shall see the Son of Man, which is a messianic title, sitting at the right hand of power and coming with the clouds of heaven. And what is Caiaphas' response? He rips his garments because he thinks he has just heard blasphemy. And then he has found a crime worthy of death in Israel, but one which the Romans will not accept for the death penalty. And so he has to go stand trial before Pilate as well. Tearing his clothes, the high priest said, what further need do we have of witnesses? He has enough to convince Israel that Jesus has to die. You have heard the blasphemy. How does it seem to you? And they all condemned him to be deserving of death. They couldn't condemn him to death, but they believed now that he deserved it. Some began to spit at him, just as he had predicted in chapter 10. They blindfolded him and beat him with their fists, and to say to him, prophesy, and the officers received him with slaps in the face. It's at this point that we also get Mark's statement that Peter did indeed deny Jesus 3 times before the beginning of the day. And it's at these very early hours of the morning that Pilate is awakened so as to hold trial with Jesus. And it's in these pre-dawn hours that the entire trial takes place. Again, the Jews could not execute their own criminals. Rome had stripped them of that power 4 months earlier. Blasphemy was not a capital offense in Rome, so Pilate had to find something else to convict him of, and Pilate's not as desirous of finding something to convict him of. He's not going to be searching for something in the same way that the Pharisees were, and in fact, Mark's statements about the trial before Pilate is very reduced compared to John's. But really, there are just 2 different accusations that they could bring against Jesus that they would need to prove that would result in crucifixion. That is treason, the betrayal of a governing authority, or sedition, inciting of a civil rebellion. Well, Mark records only these statements of the trial before Pilate. Pilate asks Jesus, are you the king of the Jews? Why? Because Rome is the sovereign over Israel. And if Jesus is to say yes, then it's both treason and possible sedition. Jesus answers, it is as you say. Pilate could bring him up onto charges for this, but it would still be a bit of a stretch. Because, as we learn more in John's Gospel, Jesus clearly does not pose a threat to Rome. He says, my kingdom is not of this world. But if it were, your kingdom couldn't stand against it. Herod returns, he sends him to Herod, and Herod sends him back, but this isn't recorded in Mark. And so finally, Pilate finds no guilt in Jesus and offers, based on a custom that Rome had begun, probably to keep the peace in Israel. They had a custom of releasing one of the criminals that they had taken back to Israel. And so they give them the option between Barnabas and Jesus. And while Pilate is preoccupied hearing a message from his wife, the Pharisees begin to convince all of the people to choose Barnabas instead of Jesus, and then to emphatically shout, crucify him, when asked what to do about Jesus. Remember, though, the principle about what happens to the forerunner happens to the king. What happens to John happens to Jesus as well. And so remember back in Mark chapter 6, verses 25 to 26, how John's execution came to be. Immediately she came in a hurry to the king and asked, saying, I want you to give me at once the head of John the Baptist on a platter. And although the king was very sorry, he didn't want to do it, just as Pilate doesn't want to do it, yet because of his oaths and because of his dinner guests, he was unwilling to refuse her. Pilate said to them, Why? What evil has he done? But they shouted all the more, Crucify him. Wishing to satisfy the crowd, Pilate released Barabbas for them, and after having Jesus scourged, he handed him over to be crucified. That brings us to the very last few verses. And once again, just as Mark does, he handles this in very summary fashion. Well, it begins by Jesus being mocked, just as he said he would be. They dressed him in purple, royal garments. Matthew 27:28 calls it scarlet, which probably looks towards the color of blood. They put on a crown of twisted thorns, something we might recall from Genesis 3:18. The beginning of thorns was the beginning of the curse. Jesus is taking the curse upon his own head. He was beaten with a reed. In Matthew 27:29, we're given more detail about this, that this is a mockery of him as a king, that he's given a kingly scepter, a reed that bends in the wind. He is spat at, the Romans kneel and bow before him, mocking his kingship. They strip him of his purple garment that they had put on him, and they send him out. And they have Simon the Cyrene help him carry the cross. Well, he arrives in Golgotha, carrying his cross, and they crucify him there on the hillside. They offer him a sedative, wine mixed with myrrh, and he refuses it. He is suffering on behalf of mankind, and he's not deadening his senses to it. He's bearing it fully in his body. Well, they had him hung on the cross, or hanged on the cross finally, at 9 a.m. in the morning. Sometimes we don't realize just how early this was, but it was at night that they arrested him, and all through the night he is undergoing trial between Herod and Pilate and Caiaphas and even Annas, which we're told in Matthew. And he's finally convicted and scourged, mocked, and crucified by 9 a.m. in the morning where the Passover sacrifice is beginning to be offered in the temple. So at the same time, the priests are gathering in the temple to slay the Passover lambs. Israel is gathering outside the temple to see the crucifixion of the true Passover lamb. They brought him to the place of Golgotha, which is translated place of a skull, and they tried to give him wine mixed with myrrh, but he did not take it, and they crucified him and divided up his garments among themselves, casting lots for them to decide what each man should take. It was the third hour when they crucified him. The inscription of the charge against him read, "The King of the Jews." After being crucified, we get more statements of his mocking, again, explicitly fulfilling the statements of Jesus in his predictions of his death that he would be mocked. Mark emphatically points this out more than any of the other gospel writers. The two beside him were both robbers. He is mocked, and those passing by hurl abuses at him, wag their heads as they see him, and they ask if he is going to destroy and rebuild the temple, mocking his prediction of the destruction of the temple, which, mind you, was a consequence of their rejection. They're mocking the very consequence of rejecting him as their Messiah. And then they try to tempt him to come off the cross, just as Peter had done, tempting him not to go to the cross, not to go to his death, for which Jesus repudiated him and told him, "Get behind me, Satan." He's mocked by the leaders, the priests who are there, and they tell him, if you're the Messiah, save yourself. They also tempt him to come off the cross. We see Satan's campaign here to try to get him off the cross. Remember, the gospel began with the temptation of Satan in the wilderness, in which Jesus proved himself to be the Messiah of God. And here he is proving himself to be the Savior of the world. They not only mocked him to save himself and to come off the cross, but they said essentially, there's a sign we'll believe. Come off the cross. Save yourself. That'll be something we'll believe. Well, all of the other signs they had rejected. Jesus had told them there would be no more signs, save for the sign of Jonah, that the Son of Man would be killed, would spend 3 days in the grave, and would rise again on the third day. He is about to show them a sign that they will reject, but the sign that they're asking for is not one that he can give. And then, adding salt to the wound, the two criminals beside him mock him on the cross. At noon, after he had been on the cross for 3 hours, darkness falls over the whole land. And if some extra biblical resources are to be trusted, it appears that perhaps the entire Middle East was shrouded in darkness, if not the entire world, for those 3 hours that he spent on the cross, the last 3 hours. And it's high noon, and it's too dark to see. He cries out, Eloi, Eloi, lama sabachthani, which means, my God, why have you forsaken me? Eloi means my God in Aramaic, but it's also very similar to the Hebrew word Eli, which is Elijah. And remember, they thought that John the Baptist might have been Elijah. And then when they asked Jesus asked his disciples who they think he is, his disciples say, well, some think you're Elijah. Well, why? Because they believe that Elijah must come before the Messiah. And so even those who believed would think as he's crying out Eli, that Eli is going to come and save him, and that will be the beginning of the kingdom. They still have not understood. But then he is given sour wine because he is thirsty. And it says that they wait to see if Elijah will come and save him. Well, then we get this statement that Jesus uttered a loud cry and breathed his last, and the veil of the temple was torn in two from top to bottom. And when the centurion was standing right in front of him, he saw the way he breathed his last and said, truly this man was the Son of God. The Roman centurion who is crucifying him completes Peter's statement of Jesus' identity. Peter says, truly you are the Christ. And the Roman centurion says, truly this man was the Son of God. There were also some women looking on from a distance. Among them were Mary Magdalene and Mary, the mother of James the Less, and Joseph and Salome. And when he was in Galilee, they used to follow him and minister to him, and there were many other women who came up with him to Jerusalem. But no disciples, save alone for John, came to his crucifixion. They had all fled. Mark doesn't tell us that John was there. After his crucifixion, after his death, Joseph of Arimathea, a member of the Sanhedrin, one of the Pharisees, goes to Pilate and asks for the body. Pilate at first does not give him the body because he's surprised that Jesus is already dead. Usually a crucifixion takes much longer, but Jesus had given his own spirit. He had given up his own life. Willingly, they did not take it from him. And so Pilate sent to make sure that Jesus was actually dead. And once they confirmed that he was actually dead, Pilate allowed Joseph of Arimathea to take Jesus' body, to which he crudely wrapped in a linen cloth and put in his own tomb, the tomb of a rich man. A stone was rolled over the entrance, and Mark notes that Mary, the same one who had prepared him for his death, was there watching where they had buried him. Well, on the day of resurrection, 3 days later by the Jewish way of counting, which is just 2 nights later and then the morning following, after the Sabbath was over, so the first of the week, the beginning of Sunday, the sun was rising on the first day of the week, and the Marys bring spices to properly prepare his body for burial. The Sabbath was over. Mary Magdalene and Mary the mother of James and Salome brought spices so that they might come and anoint him. Who is not here? Mary, the sister of Martha, is not here. She had seen, but she doesn't come again. She had actually come earlier in the morning. This is not reported by Mark, it's reported by Matthew. Very early on the first day of the week, they came to the tomb when the sun had risen, and they were saying to one another, "Who will roll away the stone for us from the entrance of the tomb?" Looking up, they saw the stone had been rolled away, although it was extremely large. Entering the tomb, they saw a young man sitting at the right, wearing white robes, and they were amazed. Every time we have seen amazed so far in the gospel, it is met with, and they didn't understand, or because they didn't understand, because they didn't believe, or they were astonished, they were astounded. They said, and he said to them, "Do not be amazed. You are looking for Jesus the Nazarene, who has been crucified. He has risen. He is not here. Behold, here is the place where they laid him." He's showing them evidence that what Jesus had predicted about his own death had concluded the same way he had predicted as well, with his resurrection on the third day. "But go, tell his disciples and Peter, he is going ahead of you to Galilee. There you will see him, just as he told you." Remember, Jesus said, or Mark rather had told us, this is the beginning of the gospel of Christ. The story is not over. And here at the very end of the gospel, we learn that the story is continuing. Jesus will meet them in Galilee. There is work for them to be done. Their service is not done. But they went out and fled from the tomb, for trembling and astonishment had gripped them, and they said nothing to anyone, for they were afraid. It's a very powerful way for John to end his gospel, but one that makes a lot of sense if we're following along, because the story clearly is not over, because just as the blind man had received his sight in stages, so these individuals receive their sight in stages, and they're coming to believe in Jesus, the Son of God. Well, let's end with a word of prayer. Dear Father, we do thank you and we praise you for the gospel of your Son, Jesus Christ. We thank you that he suffered and died on our behalf as the Savior of the world, providing a sacrifice fit for all who believe in him. We do praise you in the name of your Son, Jesus. Amen.